It's good to see you out this morning. If you will, open your Bibles to Proverbs 23. That would be the first place that we look, Proverbs 23. I know John and I were discussing very briefly this morning about writing arrangements for this Saturday, and if anybody else needs to make arrangements, talk to John or I will try to figure out something to get to where we need to be on Saturday morning. I got to talk to a couple really good friends about a week and a half ago. Yeah, that sounds about right. And we were talking over some topics, and Proverbs 23 came up. One of the questions that came up is, why is it that we seem to be so acutely attuned to other people's mistakes and problems and seem to be so blind to our own? Why is it that we can profess the truth and be right about that and fail to see the problems that, the times that we fail to live up to our own standards or God's standards in our own lives? And yet we are so acute to notice all the problems and mistakes that other people are doing, or at least sometimes our perceptions of their mistakes and problems. And that is a complicated question, and I don't intend to have all of the answers today. But I think one of them is a lack of wisdom. That we can see other people's problems but not see our own. And so Proverbs 23:23 comes up, but I want to look a couple verses around that. Start with me in verse 22. Look what Solomon says about wisdom in verse 22 and down to verse 26. Solomon says, "Listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Buy truth and do not sell it. Buy wisdom and instruction and understanding. The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice, and he who fathers a wise son will be glad in him. Let your father and your mother be glad, and let her who bore you rejoice. My son, give me your heart, and let your eyes observe my ways." Wisdom is taking the knowledge that you have and putting into practical application. It is taking the book smarts and putting into street smarts. It is taking all the theoretical things and figuring out how to live those things on a daily basis. And Solomon has some key points of how to gain wisdom in these verses. Notice what he says there in verse 22 rather. He says, "Listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old." The very first element he mentions in this series of verses is the idea of listening. I remember the old saying of the one guy talking to his friend saying, "I wish at times like this, I remember what my mom told me when I was young." And his friend said, "Why? What did she say?" He said, "I don't know, I didn't listen." Oftentimes there is all kinds of wisdom that is told around us, and we just fail to attune our ears to it. We'll look at a couple passages earlier in Proverbs where he tells us to tune our ears to listen to wisdom, to make ourselves attentive to those things. Listening is key. My grandfather was a big fan of saying that you may only hear something once in your life, so you always need to pay attention. Now, he told me that about 30,000 times, which always seemed a bit ironic, but he was right. Sometimes the information that you need is going to be given to you, and you have to decide to hear it. And so that's what Solomon begins there in verse 22. "Listen to your father and do not despise your mother." The next element regarding wisdom is there in verse 23. He tells us to buy truth and do not sell, to buy wisdom, instruction, and understanding. Now we know in James chapter 5 that God gives us wisdom freely, to all without reproach. But that isn't to say that there isn't a cost associated with it. There's no dollar amount you can pay for wisdom, but there is going to be something you have to invest. And part of that's going to be time. Here in verse 23, that if you want to buy wisdom, you have to invest your time in those things, that you're going to have a search for it. You're going to have to spend time with people who have the wisdom you need. You have to spend time digging into God's word to find out what you need to know. You also need to pay up when it comes to your pride. You have to have the feeling and the understanding and the true belief that you don't have all the answers. If you believe yourself to be wise and understanding, then you're never going to try and get that from something else or somebody else. You have to give up your pride and your selfishness to believe that your ego, that you have all the answers figured out. You have to admit that to yourself that you don't, in order to gain that from somebody else. But whatever cost that's associated, whatever input that you have to give in order to get wisdom, Solomon always makes the point through Proverbs that it is worth it. That there is no cost to gain wisdom that isn't worth it. Doesn't mean that all the struggles in life go away if you have wisdom. What it means is that when those struggles do come up, you're going to have a head start. You're going to have a leg up on everybody else around you to know how to handle those problems, how to handle those struggles. Wisdom doesn't eliminate problems in life, but it makes it easier to deal with the problems in life. And so Solomon spends so much time in the book of Proverbs talking to his son to listen to his words and attune his ear to wisdom and to search for it and to buy it. Now, as we look down here in verse 26, there's a third element I would like to point out. He says, "My son, give me your heart and let your eyes observe my ways." There are a lot of things that you can learn by observation that you cannot learn everywhere else. Learning is a multifaceted thing. And we usually take all three of these elements in verses 22, 23, and 26 to teach someone. We tell them what we need them to know. We then ask them to invest themselves into that learning process by spending their time or their efforts. And then we have them observe somebody doing the process correctly. And all three of those elements are present here. And yet the question still comes up, why is it that so often that is not the case, that you find individuals who seek out wisdom, who are investing themselves in it? It seems that we do fairly well in our congregations of teaching doctrine. Through sermons and short talks in Bible classes, we get to hear 35 minutes or 40 minutes of a very boring guy on Sunday. We get to have Bible classes on Sunday morning and Bible classes on Wednesday night. Sometimes we have home studies that go on throughout the week, or we get together with other people vis-a-vis internet and have other studies. We're going to have studies on Saturday for 4 hours listening to more people talk about stuff. We do a really good job sometimes of dealing with doctrine. And I don't mean that we shouldn't do less. But as proficient as we are in those things, sometimes we are lacking in gaining of wisdom or passing on of wisdom. Knowing how to put those practices into action. Taking all the doctrine and then putting it into our lives. There are so many areas of Christianity that is really hard to learn from a sermon or from a Bible class. Self-control is one of those areas. I can say the word self-control and I can say it again and again and again, and we can have Bible classes of what self-control means, but spending maybe 15 minutes or an hour with somebody who has really good self-control teaches you as much, if not more. Patience is one of those things. I was talking to Laurel the other day. I think Dennis might have been out of earshot, which was fine. He's in earshot now, so I can say it again. Dennis is an excellent example of patience. He is a phenomenal example of patience. I get so impatient sometimes with jobs I'm doing or things I want to do. I do 3/4 of the way really good, and then I just want to be done with it. And so I just hurry through the last quarter and end up ruining the whole project. And Dennis is patient from beginning to end. And as much as I can say the word patience, getting to work alongside Dennis teaches me far more about patience than a book can. And that's what I mean by sometimes we need to spend time with individuals who have those lessons. In fact, what we have is in Titus chapter 2, there's a whole list of things that Titus lays out. There are things that are going to be used, that you use examples more than you use sitting down and having book teaching. We'll look at Titus's list in a few moments. He teaches things like kindness and integrity, dignity, patience, sound speech, learning how to love your family properly. Some of these things we seem to be virtues that should come naturally. Who doesn't believe that they just naturally love their husbands or their wives or their children properly? And yet, we find out that there are a lot of ways to try to show love that are really not love. There's a lot of things that we believe are patience, but aren't really all that patient. Times that we believe that we are showing integrity or dignity, and we do neither one of those things and still believe ourselves to be walking in those paths. We have a very unique way of excelling in our knowledge and then failing spectacularly in our application from time to time. An application of doctrine often needs wisdom. It is knowing how to show comfort to someone who is downtrodden. It is knowing how to show love to an enemy, and when to correct someone who is in the wrong, and how to do it properly. All of those things we know what to do, but it's the how to do it that takes wisdom to do so. And it's not that our congregations are lacking wisdom. And I think a great analogy for it is that our world is not lacking food. We talk about the food shortage. We have an abundance of food. We have enough food to feed everybody. We have a distribution problem. Getting the food where it needs to be in a timely fashion, that's what we have. And as a congregation, it's not that we lack wisdom. Sometimes what we have is we have a distribution problem, where we have wisdom, but we don't have the distribution for it to get to the right places, the individuals who need it. And so we need to have good ways to do that. And if we go to Mark chapter 10, we'll look at two passages in Mark real quick. Solomon addresses us in Proverbs 23:22 to listen to our fathers, not despise our mothers. Building on that same idea here in Mark chapter 10, Jesus makes the point in verse 29 and in verse 30. That I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brother or sister or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands, with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. And if you go back just a couple of chapters into Mark chapter 3, Jesus gives us an insight into what he means by that. Remember, Jesus' physical mother and brothers in verse 32 are seeking him, and the crowds have told him this. And he says, who are my mother and my brothers in verse 33. And in verse 34, looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers, those who do the will of God. He is my brother and my sister and my mother. Solomon encourages us to listen to our fathers and not despise our mothers. Jesus tells us when we are a part of his kingdom, we have 100-fold we had before of mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. And he tells us here very clearly in Mark chapter 3, the ones who do God's will are our mothers and our brothers and our sisters. Where do we look for when it comes to wisdom, if it isn't for some of the older ones who, through their example in life, have proven themselves to be individuals who have wisdom? We have so the question comes up, if we have the wisdom within our midst, and sometimes we fail to grasp it, why do we have that distribution problem? Is it that we who are younger have a lack of desire to gain wisdom? Where Solomon tells us to buy it and we just said, we're not going to spend the time for it? Is it that we lack the time to spend with those who have wisdom? Our schedules are extremely busy. We have all these modern conveniences to make our lives faster paced and quicker, and so we can have more time, and yet even with all the more time that we have, we still have ways to spend it. Is it that our schedules are just so jam-packed that we don't have time left over to invest in buying wisdom? Or are our priorities focused on spending time with our friends or various activities or simply having fun? And I think in all these areas, as most things in life, it's a little bit of all of them. It's not just one particular thing that causes the problem, it's a variety of reasons. So I want to talk about just a couple of those things for a moment. We had already looked over in Proverbs 23:23. Turn me to James chapter 1. Gaining wisdom doesn't just happen. We have to have a desire for wisdom. Like most things, wisdom doesn't just happen. It comes with effort. It comes with work. And here in James chapter 1, there in verse 5, he says, if any one of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. And prayer is the very best place to begin. It is the best place because God is the the resource for all wisdom and all knowledge. And if you want to truly gain wisdom and knowledge, that you need to go to the source. Now, what James doesn't say here is that wisdom just will automatically fall out of the sky for you. God provides, and we are told to continue to ask God for our daily bread. And he will provide daily bread. It doesn't mean that you don't have to go to work on Monday morning, because God is going to give daily bread. In fact, that's the exact opposite point he makes, that we need to be both diligent in our work, and then God will bless that. Solomon is a wonderful example. Over in 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon prays to God that he would give him wisdom, and God grants him wisdom. And yet when he teaches us in the book of Proverbs, he tells us to buy wisdom, which means that there's an investment involved. And turn with me to Proverbs chapter 2. We'll look at 2 more passages in the book of Proverbs where Solomon talks about the effort that we need to put in. Proverbs chapter 2, starting there in verse 1. He says, "My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, make your ear attentive to wisdom and incline your heart to understanding. Yes, if you will call out for insight and raise up your voice for understanding, if you seek for it like silver, and if you search for it as hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding." Now, notice what he says there is that God gives wisdom. And if you shout for it, you will receive. But notice what he also says there in verse 4. That you shall seek it like silver, and you shall search for it like hidden treasure. There is going to be an effort and a desire that goes along with it. And here in chapter 4, in verse 5 and in verse 7, he says the same phrase twice. He says in verse 5, "Get wisdom and get insight. Do not forget and do not turn away from the words of my mouth." And in verse 7, in the beginning of wisdom is this, to get wisdom. And whatever you get insight. There has to be desire. And we who are younger, we should want it. Why wouldn't we want it? Why wouldn't we want to have a leg up on life? Life is hard enough, let alone being foolish in the process. And if we have a resource that is valuable like silver and valuable like a hidden treasure, and is just waiting for us to reach out and to grasp it, why not? And that's the point that Solomon makes over and over again in the book of Proverbs, is get wisdom, get insight, get understanding, buy truth. The resources are there, utilize them. Solomon tells us that we should call out for insight and seek it like silver, to search for it like hidden treasure. Remember all the times as a kid that you went to look for hidden treasure? I don't know if you guys had the same childhood I did. We lived up in the mountains of West Virginia, and according to me and my cousin, hidden treasure was everywhere around us. So we dug all over the place. Never found it, but we searched really hard for it. That same childhood zeal and passion for buried treasure, for that lost something, is the same zeal that Solomon encourages his son to have, that same childlike zeal and desire for knowledge and wisdom. Turn me to Titus chapter 2. We had alluded to Titus. We want to spend a couple more minutes there. Not only should we, as the younger one, should desire wisdom and desire to learn, we also understand that part of that comes along with individuals who have that. And that takes time. Here in Titus chapter 2, start with me there in verse 1. Titus 2 and verse 1. "But as for you, teach what accords with sound doctrine. Older men are to be sober-minded and dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and so train the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind and submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. Likewise, urge the younger men to be self-controlled and to show yourselves in all respect to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, a dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us. We looked at what Jesus says in Mark chapter 10 and in Mark chapter 3, that we are given a wealth of information and knowledge in the mothers and the fathers that we have inside the church. Paul writes to Titus here and tells him to utilize those things to pass on knowledge, to have that information flow from one to another. For the older men to first themselves to be this way, and secondly to pass it on to the younger men. For the older women to be that way, and then to pass the knowledge on and the wisdom on to younger women. I want you to consider for a few moments the sermons that you remember. I don't mean the ones from the last 2 years. That is irrelevant to this point. I remember, I think, if my memory is correct, Mom told me that my first place I ever went after the hospital was to church. And that's been the case my entire life, even though a lot of times I just sat and I drew and wandered off my line and didn't have a heart for God for part of that time. But of all of those years, all 32 years, I can probably remember maybe a handful or maybe 2 handfuls worth of sermons where I have specific ideas and details of what was said. But I can't count on all my fingers and toes, and even all of your fingers and toes, all of the life lessons that I learned by simply spending time with older people. But all the years of sermons don't even equal up to the kind of wisdom that I get to learn from just being around others. Whether that's the times that I was told to go and to work with them. I mean, I remember raking yards and building decks together, and all the chores that you do around a house just to help somebody else out. Or being told just to go and to mow the yard for somebody else, or sitting around the back porch and snapping green beans and getting ready for canning. All those things that seem so boring as kids, but as an adult make such a huge impact. Why don't we spend more time with them? Why don't we search for wisdom like silver and seek it like treasure? We have robbed ourselves of one of the greatest resources that God has given us, and that is the people around us. There is no more effective way, as Paul tells Titus, to pass along this kind of information and then to spend time with individuals who are older men and older women. You get to learn lessons that you never expected to learn. They get to point out problems in your life that you don't get to see. And oftentimes, they're so kind in doing it. They're so gentle in the way that they approach you that it's almost a pleasure to be corrected sometimes. And that's such a strange way of looking at it, but it's the truth. I can see some of the older individuals who have learned these same life lessons nodding their head because they got to do these exact same things. We need to make it a priority in our lives, much like Paul is telling Titus to encourage his congregation to make a priority in their lives. And if we get so busy, caught up in everything else in life, all of our sports activities and all of our social activities and all of our after-school clubs and all of our other things that we just don't have time for other Christians, then we are simply robbing ourselves. In Acts chapter 2, whenever they heard the gospel and the 3,000 souls were added to the Lord, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, the breaking of bread, and the fellowship. One of the key aspects of a growing congregation that went from 3,000 to 5,000 the next time a number was mentioned, to a congregation that spread across the globe, one of the key aspects was they devoted themselves to fellowship. Turn with me to Romans chapter 12. I just have a couple last points. Spending time with other members of the church is not something that is simply a one-off thing. That it's not just that you spend time with them and you gain wisdom and that's all that comes about from it. It is a crucial and a key part of a variety of aspects of Christianity. And just one of those aspects here in Romans chapter 12 and verse 10, he tells us to love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Now, I think those are things that are really, really, really difficult, bordering on impossible, that if I only see you on Sundays and Wednesdays, then how do I ever really, truly love you with brotherly affection? If I don't know you outside a Bible study and worship service, how can I outdo you in showing honor? How do I get to show brotherly love? Or in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2, where he tells us to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, one of those verses we probably have memorized. How do I bear your burdens if I don't know you well enough to know what your burdens are? Or how do I bear your burdens by simply sitting next to you or across the room from you on a Sunday morning or across the table from you on a Wednesday night? Those things are things that take time with one another. There are so many benefits that you get from spending time. It's not just that you get to reap wisdom, but you also get to perform all your other duties as a Christian. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 13 to owe no one anything except to love one another, for love fulfills the law. And those things take time with one another. And there are so many other benefits that we can list. How many times have you, if you have lucky enough to have your grandparents around, have your grandparents mentioned how much they miss seeing you? How much they long to spend more time with you? There's nothing pretty much that some people want more than just to have more time to spend with others. Or all their lives they spent working, and they want it more everything else, and now that all they have is time, well, they want to spend that time with not working, and not always with all their other hobbies, but they want to spend it with people. They're going to feel loved if you spend time with them. You're going to feel loved if you spend time with them. I can almost guarantee you that. There is so much love to be felt inside the church, and if we don't take the time to be around people, we rob ourselves of being loved the way that God has intended us to be loved. We also rob them of getting to show them the love that they need. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, he tells us to esteem others as more significant than ourselves. Again, another command that you can't do if you don't spend time with others. There's a whole host of added blessings. You get to learn things that you never expected to learn. You get to build relationships that you didn't think that were going to be possible. You get to respect and to care for and love God's church the way that he intended you to. If I were to wrap it up, I would wrap it up with exactly what we started with in Proverbs 23:23, to buy wisdom. What he says in Proverbs chapter 2, to seek for it, to search for it. And what James says in James chapter 1 verse 5, to pray for it. Our church is not lacking in wisdom. What we're lacking sometimes is a distribution. And that has a lot to do with your personal desires and your personal wants. We should want wisdom. And we should learn what it takes to get wisdom. God has provided all that we need, and he promises that if you ask for it, truly ask for it without doubting, he will give generously. Make your life easier. Buy wisdom. Buy insight. Buy truth, and do not sell it. So that's my encouragement this week, is to really evaluate your life and say that God does give wisdom generously without reproach. And that I have an obligation in that process. And to ask yourself, what have you done the last couple of weeks to seek for wisdom? Or if you are the individuals who, as Solomon says, are blessed with the beautiful gray head, what have you done to take some time to spread wisdom? And that's my challenge for this week. The invitation song that's been picked out is number 840. Solomon tells us in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7 that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And the world has done a very good job of spreading a lack of fear. And we don't fear judgment. We don't fear God's punishment. But we let God sit in the back burner of our mind, and we don't do anything about it. And sometimes weeks or months or even years go by before we really consider what God demands of us. Don't let the opportunity go by. Don't spend another moment before you turn back to God if this is where you are at this time. If you need anything, let us know as we stand and sing number 840.
Hark the gentle voice of Jesus calling tenderly upon your ear. Sweet his cry of love and pity calleth, turn and listen, stay and hear. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, lean upon your dear Lord's rest. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, come and I will give you rest. Take his yoke, for he is meek and lowly. Bear his burden, to him turn. He who calleth is the Master holy. He will teach if you will learn. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, lean upon your dear Lord's rest. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, come and I will give you rest. Take his loving tender voice,